If you've been a software developer for a while, you've probably heard of the domain-driven design practices that became popular around the turn of the millennium. One of the main concepts that this philosophy talks about is events. Events can be seen in the context of an ubiquitous language, which is a set of nouns and verbs and relationships between those things in the context of a domain. The ubiquitous language formalises those things. In short, the nouns are called entity and the verbs are called events. When talking about events, it can be tempting to think of them as being messages. And they are, in sort of a way, when something happens to an entity in a DDD domain, something has to have performed that action. So yes, it is a message of sorts, but oftentimes those messages could be stored to the data store and treated instead as a record of a fact. This event occurred at this time and had this data associated with it. There are two main ways that you can represent an object. The first is to store that object's current state, and whenever you want to change that object, you load the entire state, warts and all, change the object, and then store the new state. The other is to store a starting state and any individual state changes or events that add up to the final state. The tension arises about when do you want to have the performance impact, when do you save the changes, or when do you load them. If you need to show the object's history, then perhaps you don't really have a choice anyway. You might as well save yourself some storage. For large objects, storing a new change as a delta in a list of changes could actually be pretty efficient. For some objects with a long history, storing the current state instead might actually be easier. This is going to be a trade-off for your workload. There's another tension related to how much complexity you want to have to keep track of in your data store and in your logic. Loading an aggregate is complex and pretty annoying, particularly if there are a lot of branches and leaves and multiple levels. If there's more than one and the aggregate's large, in other words, there are a lot of sub-records in your entity, then you're going to have to decide how many queries you want to perform in your transaction. Particularly, this is because of the rectangular nature of the result sets that most databases return from queries. If there are a lot of different leaves on different sub-records, then you're going to end up with a Cartesian product. That kind of effect is when the size of your result set is a multiple of the counts of the records in each of your leaves, and the trade-off is that you'll otherwise have to perform multiple select queries and pay the impact of each round trip associated with each. So, like, do you want a really large result set, or you want lots of smaller result sets where the sum of those is smaller, but you also want to have to pay the round trip for each of those? So single records are so much easier. In any case, you have to decide whether to store an event directly as an event or simply process the event in your service tier and store the state of the object or entity or aggregate after having performed the operation. It's your choice and will come down to your goals. There's one thing that I don't think has ever been well addressed in domain-driven design, and that's where you have some kind of record that represents a relationship between two different entities. And in some ways, this kind of thing might belong in one aggregate or the other, but in a lot of systems, at least as far as the user is concerned, the relationship exists in both. This is also true for events that occur between two entities. How are you dealing with your events? Let me know in the comments. One thing that you'll have to contend with if you decide that you're going to store your aggregate as a list of events is that you're going to have to influence how your object is stored in memory when you're operating on it. In short, you'll have to hold the events in memory too, in each of the layers that need to understand the events. In other words, in your data store, in your service tier, and in your front end. That's not bad. I just think it's a little bit counterintuitive if you've been used to dealing with state. Talk to you next time.